the German Climate Pavilion at COP29 in Baku. Germany. Climate solutions, fast and fair.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon. I was going to say welcome to the German Pavilion, but I think the next speaker's job is to welcome us here. But it's wonderful to see you here for this really exciting event. I'm MelanieRobinson, and I'm the Global Director for Climate, Economics and Finance at the World Resources Institute, WRI, and it's a pleasure to have you here. And we're here to talk about NDCs and investment. And what more important topic could you find for us to be discussing? This COP is the finance COP. It's all about investment. But investment for what? Investment to implement NDCs and to achieve our climate goals. And we know that it's only with confidence that there will be investment that countries want to put forward ambitious NDCs. And then it's only knowing that there will be investment behind them that you can create the virtuous circle of implementing the NDCs, more ambition, more finance. So today we want to look at the relationship between the two. But we want to explore that relationship in a slightly more systematic way than maybe some think about. Some think, oh, I have an NDC, now I'll develop some projects, and I'll get some finance. But actually, we know that that doesn't create system change. We know that you have to think about how do you integrate your climate and indeed nature goals into your economic planning. How do you turn that into systemic transitions, energy transitions, or nature transitions? And how do you put finance behind those in a really systematic way, in a way that stacks the capital and uses public and private, national and international capital in the right way? And we're going to look today at some examples of where that's happened and see what we can learn from those examples as we go forward into further JETPs and country platforms. So I'm very excited about today, and I hope you are too. We've got a fantastic lineup here. We're going to have our opening speaker as a State Secretary for PMZ, JochenFlasbarth, and I'm going to pass to him now before introducing our panel. But it's a great honor to have you with us, State Secretary, and if you'd like to come to the stage.
Thanks a lot. Very happy to be here to discuss or to kick off the discussion of a very relevant topic. I mean, we are talking here a lot about, as the moderator said, about finance, and rightly so. But this all has to have a meaning behind it. And that is the target of the Paris Agreement. We know it's not something nice to have to keep it at 1.5. In the Paris Agreement, it's well below 2 degrees, and with a view to 1.5. But after the special assessment of the IPCC, everybody knows that actually there is not an option to choose between 2 and 1.5. These are so tremendously different worlds that it is imperative to go for 1.5 degrees. So this has to be reflected in the next generation of the NDCs, 3.0. And we all know to achieve this, we have to multiply our investments in climate technologies and climate investments, specifically in renewable energy. And I just want to remind us, because sometimes people ask me, is this whole process having any progress? And I would say, so yes. Looking back to Dubai, we agreed to triple the renewable energy investments. I think that is something. It's an agreement. And from many discussions with our partner countries as BMZ, we know that many, many countries take this really serious. So this is progress, and now we have to build up on this progress. And that brings me to the numbers. So the 2.4 in average trillion are flooding around. We Germans always have to be careful not to mix it with billions, which what it is in the German language. Then it would be easy, but it's trillions. But to be clear, and sometimes also at our national audiences, people are puzzled and are afraid. Do we taxpayers have to pay for it? No, no, definitely not. And even if we would have the financial resources to pay this all by public finance, it would be nonsense to do so. We need to get the private sector in, and that is what brings us to the challenges, what to do to get these markets to kick off. No, they have kicked off, but to boost them. And one point I want to mention also as a kind of input to the panel later on is we need to have the right framework in our countries. It is not that we can pay everything just in the surroundings that we have at the moment. We have to make changes. Regulatory framework, incentives, all this has to come together. And it starts with having the right target. And I want to give you a tiny little example from my own experience in my own country. We had a target, a climate target for a long time that was 80 to 95% greenhouse gas reductions until 2050. And what happened is that each and every sector and the companies were of the belief that these 20 to 5% would belong to them. So nobody moved. And everybody was finger pointing to the other sector. When we changed it to 100% reduction, greenhouse gas neutrality first by 2050, and then we enhanced our target time-wise to 2045, then a lot happened. Even fossil companies came to me to discuss with me about their way to reduce and to be fully decarbonized in time to 2045. So setting the right target is number one. Setting the right regulation is number two. And then things can develop. And now my second input is how to collaborate with our partner countries in the global south. And I think you mentioned, Melanie, the JETPs as one example of country platforms. I said it earlier today, I'm a true believer in this kind of collaboration. It makes it much easier to our partner countries if we come together as groups, different groups of partner countries on the so-called donor side. I don't like the word donor in this regard, as we did it with the JETPs. It's much better for the country that we are coming together instead of each of us coming in different times, knocking at their doors with different ideas how to get this done and to start a conversation how this all is doable, and always with the imperative that, of course, our partner countries are in the driving seat. They are deciding on their policies. And in this regard, also one of the takeaways from the JETP experiences is that we have to move away from the project-by-project approach. It has to be a consistent way towards the greenhouse gas targets in the respective countries. We did it in South Africa with the investment plan, also in Indonesia, in Vietnam. All of them slightly different, but the logic behind it is one holistic approach. How do we put all the different instruments and sub-targets together to make it a potential success. So I stop here for the panel discussion. All the best.
Thank you so much. What a fantastic framing for our discussion today. So now it's my great pleasure to invite our panelists to the stage. So first of all, I'd like to invite Dr. CrispianOlver. And Crispian is the Executive Director at South Africa's President Climate Commission, has been intimately involved with the preparation of the JETP, and indeed over the years has worked with the South African government and been responsible for climate policies in South Africa. So you're welcome, Crispian. I'd like to welcome KateHughes. She's the Principal Climate Change Specialist at the Asia Development Bank. So she's really responsible for making sure that the policies and processes, technical assistance, and lending of the Asia Development Bank is aligned with climate objectives. I'd like to invite Matias, Rebello, Cardomingo, who's the General Coordinator of Social and Environmental Impact Analysis in Brazil's Ministry of Finance. Brazil really leading the way on these issues at the moment. It's great to have you with us. And finally, JohnMurton, previously my colleague in the UK government, very involved in the JETP from the UK point of view, and now the Senior Sustainability Advisor at Standard Chartered Bank, so representing the private sector investment side here. So if you'll give them a round of applause so they feel confident on the stage. Crispian, I'm going to start with you because we've heard already a bit today from the State Secretary about South Africa and the JETP, and we'd love to hear from you. What are the biggest challenges in scaling the JETPs and ensuring that they deliver real measurable impacts in terms of emission reduction, energy access, job creation, and the just transition?
Thank you for the question, Melanie, and a very good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to Jochen for your remarks. I thought them very inspirational, and I do want to say Germany has stood behind South Africa's JETP and made a major contribution. And of all of the IPG countries, you were amongst the most generous. And it's without your support, we would not have accelerated this transition in the way that we have. So thank you. And I do want to also express a note of gratitude to WRI, who's been backing a lot of the work in my climate commission. So in reply to your question, I'm going to make 3 points. And the first is about leadership and ownership. So these country platforms, and I'm going to talk generally about platforms because the JETPs are an example of a country platform. I am very encouraged, by the way, to see other kinds of platforms emerging. The Colombian country platform to me is like, really best practice in this next generation. So, the vital thing is these have got to be led from the top. We've had our president standing firmly behind this. You need high-level political commitment to make these succeed. They've got to be owned by the country, and they've got to be, sorry, frog in my throat. They've got to be country-led. And aligned with the national plans, the development plans, and very importantly for us, our NDC. The last NDC that we submitted was the trigger for the JETP discussions, because we had an upper bound that we'd do on our own resources and a lower bound that we'd achieve if we were able to mobilize additional financial support. So that's my first point, leadership and ownership. Secondly, they need to be programmatic. They've got to be more than simply a loose basket of projects, and that means they've got to be linked to deep systemic reforms. And we would never have achieved the progress in our energy transition if it wasn't for our president saying, I want the cap on embedded generation lifted, I want private investment to go to scale in this transition. He drove forward the separation of transmission and generation and has insisted on the opening up of the market and the legislation to deliver that. So that was very important, as were the just transition elements, so the skills investment and labor market investment that we did. My last point is, these platforms have got to be backed by a credible finance strategy. And the foundation of that strategy is your own domestic commitment. So, we've got our national treasury firmly on board, and they're integrating this across the public finance system. You've got to bring in the private sector at scale. I mean, we put an investment plan together of $100 billion. It's, you know, much more than 10 times the 8.5 billion that was part of the JETP. So the bulk of that 100 billion comes from private sector investment. And then you need to use the scarce grant and ODA resources, firstly to fund the stuff that you can't do with commercial borrowing, but also to leverage up the rest of the capital stack. And then the MDBs and national development banks have a vitally important role in doing some of the financial engineering and de-risking and blending that's required for these. So I'll leave it at that point, Melanie.
Crispian, every time I speak to you about your experience, it's so clear what the lessons are, really, really helpful, I think, and that's why other countries are also coming to you to ask for advice. That's really, really helpful. Kate, I'm going to turn to you now. So we just heard from Crispian just how central MDBs are there to achieving that scale and impact that's required through your financial support. So how do you think you can best do that in the context of JETPs, but maybe more broadly, country platforms?
Sure. Maybe I'll just take 1 second, firstly. I live in the Philippines. Just to acknowledge, a typhoon hit the Philippines on Thursday, and a super typhoon's heading there for tomorrow. That's the 15th typhoon this season to hit the Philippines. So if we need a reminder of why this conversation is real, that's it. So just to acknowledge my home country. To your question, so I think even just from the JETP experience in Indonesia and watching South Africa, firstly, I think we need to remember the objective of why we're doing the transition. Ultimately, there's still very narrow discussions on it being an energy transition, right? Rather than a broad kind of economic reconfiguration. And then that also means that the discussion on finance and how to pay for it goes a bit narrow to a discussion only on climate finance. Whereas if we're actually talking about a transition that also looks at jobs, also looks at new industries, private sector, it's actually about the entire financial system and how we get that to work. And from the just transition perspective, we're still not seeing that really as a kind of integrated part from the outset, right? It's still about the energy transition, and then you stick the just element onto the top. And I think if you reorient that thinking, then it also calls into question the sequencing of the investments and the sequencing of the finance, because actually a lot of the non-energy related investment is needed ahead of the investment in energy or decarbonisation, whereas it tends to come afterwards. Specifically, I think on MDBs, we really have that unique position where we have deep relationships in countries, we have technical expertise and resources to put into TA, and then we can follow that with investment pipelines. But traditionally, MDBs treat those all separately as well. So as well as pursuing, I think, the programmatic approaches in countries, we need to push the way MDBs think so that they think more programmatically. And you know, as for ADB in particular, we had a climate change action plan that we put out last year, and it really looks at this continuum of support from upstream, midstream, downstream. So how do we support that really deep diagnostic work, risk assessment upstream? How do we then look at embedding in systems, so supporting budget processes, decision-making, governance, and then shift our downstream pipeline to align with that, so that it's not at the stage of when the investment's being articulated that you think about the transition, but that really the entire process is leading to an investment pipeline that's already aligned with the transition. And last point, I think, on that then means that the range of instruments that MDBs have can also come in. So yesterday, ADB had a climate change policy-based loan for Mongolia approved, and that's a full climate PBL. And that was based on a huge amount of diagnostic work to really understand what the kind of policy barriers and regulatory barriers are to climate and investment in the country. country. And then the intention is now that all of ADB's next 5-year strategy is oriented around that PBL. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thank you for bringing the reality of the Philippines into this discussion today. We're thinking of your home country as the next days come. But thank you also for bringing economic reconfiguration and the importance to join up across what MDBs do, from the diagnostic to supporting policy reform to the investment end. I think that's incredibly useful. Thank you. So, Matias, I'm going to turn to your views from Brazil, and congratulations on launching your country platform recently. So these platforms are increasingly seen as vehicles for mobilizing finance for the climate transition across these different sources of finance. So from your perspective, what do you think are the core elements of the platform that make them successful for attracting both public and private finance?
Well, first of all, I want to thank for the invitation. Thank you, Melanie, and your name, WRI, Medium, I'm seeing here, also Katie. And especially, I would like to thank the German government for all the help that it has given to Brazil to develop our initiatives and instruments. And to be quite honest, I could almost use Crispian speech now, because I think he mentioned everything that matters, inclusively thanking you guys from Germany. But I think Crispian brought one very important element that for us is being reinforced, which is the ownership of the platform and the connection of it with national determined contributions and its renewed compromise that Brazil also presented, trying to set ambition to Belém next year. And this connects with all the other instruments that we are promoting, especially, I would say, the Trust Fund Forest Forever, that it is the new endowment fund for preservation of forests, and what we call Eco-Invest, which is basically mobilizing multilateral banks to get cheaper money using the investment grade that they have, and through that catalyze private investment. So everything that we are trying to build is to mobilize the private sector towards the national, well, our NDCs, because we, as in Germany, face very strict fiscal laws and a very short fiscal space. And I want to finish with this, that I think we need to be capable of creating not only a discourse, but also an implementation plan that is capable of mobilizing political support for it. And this is very relevant because we have seen political strikes, for instance, mobilized through climate policies, and this is something that is crucial to maintain the continuity of those policies. So I think this is the broad perspective that we should have, and mobilizing funds from multilateral or from the northern side of the road to the periphery, it is something very relevant, so we can generate jobs and show that it is something in the will of everybody.
Thank you so much, Matias. And I love that you emphasize just how important catalyzing private investment is, given that budgets are tight in the global south and in the global north. And I really love the way you've just emphasized there the importance of it being a just transition. This has to be about jobs and livelihoods if you're going to keep the support of the citizens and therefore the political support. So really powerful points. Thank you for that. I'm going to turn to John next. So, John, how can the international community build on the lessons learned from the JETP and country platform initiatives to ensure they can be scaled up to meet global targets that we've got?
Thanks, and thank you to German colleagues for hosting this. And was equally inspired by Secretary Flasbarth's remarks. And just one sidebar, if I may, in terms of to give us encouragement in against perhaps a less than encouraging political context more widely. Until 6 years ago, I mean, Mr. Flasbarth was talking about how targets can be more ambitious. Until 6 years ago, the UK climate change target was 80% reduction by 2050. 3 days ago, our Prime Minister announced that the UK's, not only we know now we've had for 6 years a 100% emissions reduction target by 2050. 6 days ago, Prime Minister Starmer announced an emissions reduction target of 81% by 2035. So we're going to do more by 2035 than 6 years ago we were pledging to do by 2050. And actually, no one's really blinking. The planning is in place to do that. There's those national structures in place to look at what policy levers we need to pull to deliver that. And that's okay. So we're making progress, and that's exciting. And I think the same is true in the JETPs, and we're learning lessons, not just about the JETPs, but programmatic blended finance more generally. And I must pay testament to the exciting work being done in Brazil. And if none of you have seen it, look at the recent Eco-Invest initiative that the Brazilian government launched, where essentially they put out concessional funding and then ask private sector implementers to bid, and the companies that bid with the highest multiplication ratios, the highest mobilization ratios, won access to that concessional funding. And that's just the sort of initiative to spread your butter over more toast, if you can forgive the analogy, that I think is really helpful. So lots going on. In terms of the JETPs, I think we've been on a curve of euphoria about them, and then disappointment and despair, and then now a sort of acceptance that they're neither a silver bullet, but they actually are quite useful as well. And I think that's about the right place in terms of how we should be seeing them. I think we've learned a few lessons. We know from the structure of the JETP in South Africa that it was probably a mistake to leave out the private sector in terms of the organization from the beginning, and we rectified that mistake when we set up the Vietnamese and Indonesian JETPs, which is good because the private sector need to be there at the table. Equally, I think we've learned that the South African approach of really working from the bottom up and letting projects come to the JETPs. Is my microphone working, by the way? Can you hear me? Yeah. That letting the projects come from the JETPs, from the private sector up, get them funded, and then sort of stamp and say, yes, JETP approved. I think that's a much better way of doing things from a private sector perspective. It enables the bankable projects to progress, as distinct from saying, these are the JETP projects, now go fund them, which is really hard for the private sector to digest, because some of the projects on the list might be fully bankable, and others might be a long way from being bankable. So I think that's the thing. One of the key things that's important is regulatory change. Getting the private sector and others around the table and identifying the barriers to making projects bankable in the host country is a hugely important thing, and I commend the South African government in what they've done, and Crispin mentioned President Ramaphosa's insistence on lifting the cap on embedded generation, and the consequences of that in South Africa have been huge. You've got like 65 gigawatts of projects queued up for financing, and that's a huge transformation in a country with an installed capacity of about 50 gigawatts and 36 gigawatts available at any time. So it just shows if you unlock the regulatory change, it enables finance to flow. And what we're seeing is the JETPs are progressing fastest where countries are making the most regulatory change and when there's most competition in the energy sector, because the reality is renewables are now cheaper than coal if the market is fair. So I think that's another thing. And then the final point I'd make is, and I say this as a former student of geography and a great fan of the Crayola degree, that the geography really matters in the JETP. And we've used the just transition moniker in each of the JETPs, and I was part of the process that led to that, but I'm also sort of not sure it was the right thing to do, because what's just in South Africa, where coal mines are beginning to close, and the closure of coal power plants is on the very near horizon, and unemployment rates are very high, is completely different than what's just in a Vietnamese context, for example, where if you're talking about financing early coal power retirement, you're talking about, shutting down a power station in 2040 rather than 2050 or something, and there's very little mining industry, and employment rates are very high. The appropriate steps in each of those contexts are very different, and it's important that we remember that as we implement that a kind of one-size-fits-all doesn't progress. And so consequently, I think they're useful tools, and the very fact that we've just been able to announce this week that the Lesotho government is now wanting to set up its own Just Energy Transition Fund means that people are watching, seeing what's happening, whether it's Colombia or Lesotho or others, and saying, we actually think that's useful and we want to be a part of that process.
Thank you very much, John. Thanks for bringing us geography, but also the importance of regulatory change. And I think maybe counterintuitive to some of the governments that you think the bottom up, let the private sector bring the bankable projects and stamp it rather than top down. I wonder we would have a good debate about that. Crispian, I know you think you're next, but I'm gonna keep the audience guessing by going, yeah, I'm gonna jump about. So I'm gonna go Kate. So Kate, what can the international financial system do to improve the coherence of climate finance flows and ensure that financing for the just transition is aligned with the NDCs?
Okay, well, thanks for bringing me in next. So coherence, I think this is a big topic that we're talking about, right, in terms of scale and systematic investing. I think I alluded to it, I guess, in my first answer, that we're not just talking about climate finance, right? And when you look at the role of MDBs, it's not just about more and more and more climate finance and being deployers of climate finance. It's about creating markets for investment and also creating systems for finance to flow. And so I think you need to look at the deployment of climate finance, but the other work that goes with it, works with central banks, works on green taxonomies, all of that. As an example, we did a climate finance plan for a country in Central West Asia for its NDC, and in the first conversation they came to us with a shopping list, and they said, okay, here's the projects we want, you tell us which ones ADB will do, which ones EBRD will do, which ones will go to GCF, and what will be left. And we said, okay, let's go right back to the beginning and talk about financial system reform in your country and what reforms you need, and then look at how that relates to the NDC. And so that process, actually working with that country, and that conversation started with the Ministry of Environment because they're responsible for the NDC. But in the end of the conversation, we had the Ministry of Finance at the table and we had the Ministry of Planning at the table. And so that was a much more powerful look at how to make the finance flow. So I think that cross-government coordination and looking at it in the bigger context of finance. I think maybe specifically for the MDBs as well, some reflection as well that we need much better internal coordination, because we're also the same. We'll have one group working on green bonds. We have another group that's working over here on carbon tax in a certain country, and then those working on, ADB has the energy transition mechanism, and we're not necessarily connecting the conversations within our institutions as well. So looking at that coordination across within NDBs and then with other financiers will also help. Thanks.
Thank you so much. It's great to hear you going from a shopping list of projects into really thinking about systemic financial reform with the Ministry of Finance and the central banks. That's wonderful. I'm going to come to John. So John, we have been talking a lot already today, and we have been all week, about blended finance. So public capital being put to use to de-risk private capital. And when we look at these blended finance models, sitting as you do now in the private sector, how do you think they can be structured in a way that truly incentivizes private sector investment in countries with a more limited fiscal capacity? You gave us an excellent example there from Brazil. Can you expand on that? What really works from your point of view?
Thanks. Well, a few things. And obviously, my views are evolving as where you stand depends on where you sit. And I've moved from government, and now I'm in the private sector, so I'm on a journey. One of the first things about, and I'm going to use a few analogies, so forgive me, it's very British. One of the first things about blended finance is it's a little bit like tailoring. every blended finance deal is a little bit like a Savile Row suit. You've gone to the tailor, you've measured up, and it's all bespoke and made to you. And that's a time-consuming and lengthy process. And what that means is when you're working in a private sector organization with deal teams in a bank, the deal teams want to make deals, and they want to do it over a short time horizon. And if a project is fully bankable, off they go. If a project is not fully bankable, if it's really big, they might bother to sort of go to the public sector team and say, can we get some concessional finance for this? And that's quite a lengthy process. It can take months and months and months, which is probably worth it for a really, really big deal. But for the sort of average sized deals, the deal teams shrug and say, it's not bankable, and they move on because they don't want to spend 9 months discussing with the ADB or the African Development Bank or whoever, or however long it is. So what we're trying to do at Standard Chartered is create essentially programmatic blended finance, where we establish a partnership with someone like the ADB, and we say, right, we will fund solar plants in Laos, and anything above this size and below that size and below that, above that budget, below that budget, you'll give us a guarantee for X% of the lending, and we agree that in advance, and then we go off and find deals and we pull it off. And that's a really sort of interesting development if we can make that work, and we're trying to do that. And Kate, if you want to talk about that afterwards, we're all good on that. Another thing that I think is really important is we move from sort of co-investment to guarantees, because I think they're much easier to gradually remove than co-investment. They're much quicker to implement. And again, I use an analogy. I've got 2 sets of kids, some older ones and some younger ones. And with the older kids, when I taught them to ride a bike, we use stabilizers. You know, the little wheels on either side of the main wheel. And they're great. You learn to ride on stabilizers, but you get dependent on the stabilizers. And then it's quite difficult to make the transition. You take the stabilizers off, and there's usually a few painful instances when the kid falls to the ground and there are tears. With my younger kids, we've got this clever system. It's a handle that attaches to the back of the bike, and you run along behind the bike holding the handle, and you hold it progressively less tightly, and then gradually, when your kid isn't looking, you let go of the handle, and they don't notice, and they're cycling on their own, and they're kind of, woo, off they go, and then they realize they've cycled a long way without you holding onto them. And we need to go a bit like that, and guarantees are quite a good way of doing that. You know, banks get used to lending the whole amount of the required debt to a project to get it going, and you gradually withdraw the guarantees as credit committees get used to it, because when you're striking a deal, I have to go to my credit committee and say, you know, are we okay to bank this? And the guarantees help. And then they get used to the fact that actually they're not using the guarantees because the projects are working, and they get comfortable with the idea of that guarantee being withdrawn. So that, I think, is a really important thing. And then finally, the third point I'd make is about the cost of capital, and I think JochenFlasbarth referred to this. The cost of capital is too high in emerging markets. And part of that sort of results from the Basel sort of rules that were created to deal with the aftermath of the 2007-2008 financial crisis, but are not equipped in many ways to help us get the capital, the private capital, into emerging markets in the face of the sort of oncoming climate requirement for us to do so. And banks like my own get penalized for lending over long tenor, which is often required for project finance vehicles to get renewables off the ground. And we get penalized for lending to emerging markets. Now, in the longer term, hopefully we'll address that at a regulatory level. But in the shorter term, we think there's a lot of space for what we'd call a warehousing facility, where instead of lending for 17 years to get a solar plant off the ground, we lend for 3 years. And that creates the time to build the plant, show that it can generate the amount of power that it says on the tin. And then we've got an option, if required, to put it into a warehouse. We can refinance it ourselves, but you put it into a warehouse. And what that does is it separates the short but acute period of construction risk from the longer, much more chronic period of sort of low-level risk of operating a solar plant. And they're 2 quite different risks with 2 quite different levels of pricing that, if you're not careful, you have to price all together in a 17-year loan. But if we had the capacity to separate that, not only will we not penalized for long tenor lending, but it will enable us to price more accurately and maybe finance more facilities, and then bring your pension funds and other sort of institutional investors in to pick up functioning assets once they're up and running.
Just checking, yeah. So being British, I like your analogies. So you're going from tailoring your suits on Savile Row to going into Marks and Spencer's. I was just thinking if that would work in the audience. Going into a high street shop and getting it off the shelf. Yeah. You're going from maybe having to buy the whole suit in one go to say, I'll just buy the waistcoat now, maybe I'll get the trousers later, but I'm not going to overcommit. And you're going to use guarantees to just slowly be able to let go of that bike. I like that. That's going to help me, and I hope many others, with thinking about private financing. I'm going to save Brazil for last because I'm going to ask you to look forward to COP30. So I'm going to come to you, Crispian. And people have hinted at different times on this panel about the importance of involving the private sector. And you've all hinted, but I was hoping to hear even more about the importance of involving communities and thinking about the just transition. Now is your chance, Crispian, to tell us, how do you think the governance structure needs to be to really make sure that you're including the right people in these financial partnerships?
Yeah, good question. I mean, governance is fundamentally important to getting these country platforms right. And I guess the starting point for us, I mean, we've built a large unit in the presidency coordinating transversally across government, so that transversal coordination from a senior position in government was vitally important to success. We've struggled a little bit more on the inclusion side. I mean, I think there's some good lessons learned. When we talk just transition, I mean, one of the foundational principles of justice is procedural justice. And that means people affected by a transition have to have a seat at the table where the decisions are made. And I would, say, frankly, that's a work in progress in South Africa. We try and practice it as the Climate Commission. I think government as a whole struggles with inclusive stakeholder engagement. They're far more used to telling people what they think should happen. Inclusion is vitally important, and I want to say it's important not just for procedural justice. It's important because the kinds of transitions we're talking about are whole of society and whole of economy transitions. And government itself doesn't have all the wherewithal, all the capacities that it needs. So it leans a lot. I mean, ultimately, the machine that's going to create the jobs and drive the innovation and make the investments is the private sector. So you want to tap their capacities. You want organized labor and their ability to block processes unblocked as part of the transition. And you want the agitation and creativity that civil society organizations bring into this. Last point, I mean, bringing the private sector, in fact, bringing the entire capital stack into play is an ongoing process of mobilization. I mean, we made a bit of a mistake thinking that we'd do the deals and then the deal would be done and then we'd implement. In fact, engaging the philanthropies, engaging the IPG partners, broadening the IPG base, bringing the MDBs in, bringing the private sector in, that work is not done. And it won't be done for the duration of the transition that we need. So you need to think about that mobilization process and how you do it. And plan for, there's a lot of transactional capacity that you've got to build in order to do this properly.
Super interesting, thank you. And thank you for saying that it's hard. It's hard to do that citizen engagement. I'm sure it is for every country. It's hard to have private sector involved at the right time. And also you have to keep going. You need to be patient. It's not once and done, either with the engagement or with the investment. So thank you, Crispian, for that. So I'm going to end with you, Matias, for this section, because we have a lot of work still to do here at COP29. But as Brazil, you must be thinking about what you're going to deliver at COP30. And I would love to know, what are your expectations as the incoming presidency about the role of just energy transition platforms and country platforms in ensuring that there are more ambitious NDCs and that finance can flow behind those NDCs?
Yeah, well, so we have a long road still here in Baku, but let's hope our negotiators come to an agreement in the NCQG. But the ideal would be to have the renewed NDCs keeping up at least close to the ambition of the 1.5 goal, right? And this is something that we all know that it is not easy to be achieved, but it's something that all the instruments that Brazil is working on, Eco Invest, as John mentioned, it is one of them. The Brazilian investment platform is another one. And all of those, along with the sustainable taxonomy, are aimed at facilitating the foreign capital to come into Brazil, because we are looking to have any kind of greenian, considering our high cost of capital. And this is something that is really important for us. But also, I think that the junction of all those instruments, Brazil is seeing it as a possibility to showcase how we can mobilize these investments to other underdeveloped economies and to try to set a new stage. Belém could be the place for the announcement of important deals, but it could also be for the announcement of the adoption of those instruments. The one thing that I think it is not yet shared between the global south and the northern south and the northern globe, it is the idea and the relevance that we should give to adaptation and resilience in choosing projects. Because even though we are all hoping a lot to have an ambitious NCQG and ambitious NDCs, it will be very hard to achieve our goals, right? And this means, especially for us in the Global South, that we need to invest hugely in resilience, because we will be mostly affected by it. Well, not to talk about the vulnerable 20, right? But even all the islands in the road. So, and this is something that, as I have heard during COP here, I think mitigation projects are still much more upfront and have the light on them, including the just transition energy perspective, than the resilience part. So this is something that I think we could advance to come to Belém, considering robust investment plans that take both parts and include also the need that the underdeveloped economies have to adapt, for instance, in Brazil, to our major activities as agriculture.
Thank you so much, and really excellent to bring this adaptation resilience piece in. And I know in South Africa's G20 presidency, you will have a good presidency partner in thinking about country platforms, including the resilience aspect of that. Now, I really like this event compared to others because there's space in it for you to participate. And actually, that's what this empty chair is for. So don't be shy. What we'd like to do with this part is I've had the privilege of asking the questions of our brilliant panel thus far. Now it's your turn. If you do feel shy, you can ask your question from there. But what we would really love is that you come here and join us on the stage just while you pose your question and listen to the answer. So who's feeling brave? Come up here, Caroline. I won't know everybody's name, but I do know Caroline's.
Yes, I hope it's okay. Thank you Very much to the panel and to you, Melanie. Very interesting. My question is about, so we've talked a lot about the needed infrastructure investments and the role of different financiers into this and how they can build on each other's efforts. But there's also an issue of stranded workers, and many of the countries we talk about don't have very strong social safety nets. So how do we address that aspect, and what's the role of the different actors here on the stage? Thank you.
Who do you want to ask?
Maybe Crispian.
It's a I mean, for a coal-dependent economy like ours, 82% of our power comes from burning coal. It's a huge issue. We've got 100,000 workers in our coal value chain, and many more, people in communities linked to that. So each wage earner, supports 5, 6, sometimes 10 people. So there's a whole community. There's a million people that are going to be affected by this transition. So that's why having the just part of our transition is fundamentally important, and it really turns on livelihoods. I mean, this transition will be unsustainable for us if we're not in the process able to create more livelihoods than are destroyed as we move out of fossil fuels. So we think a lot about industrial policy. So how do you localize the supply chains and value chains in this new low carbon economy? How do we manage the labor market and particularly equip the workers for the skills that are needed in the 2030s and 2040s, and do job placement? I mean, the best kind of learning happens on the job. So work with the private sector to open up workplaces and bring young people in and place them in positions so they learn. And then you've got to think about social policy. So, there's going to be a lot of churn. A lot of people are not going to go straight from one job into another job. What's the kind of income support or unemployment insurance or early retirement for some workers? So all of that's got to be part of the package. It's not just the sort of add-on afterthought, once you've done the big infrastructure investment.
Brilliant, thank you. Actually, you've really started something here, because I know Kate and John want to say something. You're welcome to skip into the next question, but let's hear from Kate on this too.
Okay, sure. So I just wanted to share a little bit of experience. So ADB has an energy transition mechanism, which is a financial mechanism for the early retirement of coal-fired power stations. And my team has been designing the Just Transition framework for this mechanism. And we have learned so much in that process in trying to push through this first transaction. So I think the first one, and this is very much for a single project closure, right? But the first one is really on that upstream analysis. So when we started the kind of impact assessment work, everyone was very comfortable that we looked at direct impacts, and everyone was okay that we looked at indirect impacts. But when we raised the issue of induced impacts, everyone got very uncomfortable. So firstly, because it was a private sector transaction, the private sector said we have nothing to do with induced impacts. And then when we went to government and said there's potential induced impacts from this transaction, they said, but it's a private sector transaction, it's not our transaction. So between the MDBs, the government and the private sector, we are trying to work out how to look broader at those impacts that might go up the coal value chain. Maybe the second lesson, back to what I was saying before about it not only being climate finance. So one of the potential alternative industries that was mentioned is shrimp paste manufacturing, right? And that has nothing to do with the people that were initially involved in the project. So within ADB, we've had to go to completely different teams, our social sector colleagues, our other colleagues, and then even with the donors, or the partners, it's from different budgets that they have as well, because they have social budgets, health budgets, education budgets. So I think that's a way to make sure that you have that broad perspective.
Great, thank you. And John, you wanted to add something on here?
Yeah, just briefly, but it's a kind of an observation that shows the value of a country platform, and a commentary on what the South African government really did well was, if you'd have funded individual renewable power stations in South Africa to address load shedding without a country platform, you could quite easily have sucked up a lot of concessional capital on individual projects, such that there was no money left for supporting workers and as assets became stranded and coal mines shut down. Whereas the value of the country platform was you had everyone in a room together at once with South Africa, and you thought at a country-wide level, how are you going to use the concessional funding that's on offer? And the debate was about whether you did it for renewable energy, and the discussion yielded the outcome that, you know, the right thing to do was change some of the regulations in the energy sector so that renewable energy could finance itself completely in the private sector, conserving those elements of concessional capital for the things that are really hard for the private sector to do, like support affected communities in the transition. So I think that was a really smart set of outcomes that probably wouldn't have come without some of that kind of system-wide thinking that the country platform can at least help induce.
Brilliant, thank you. Carolina, what a brilliant question. You really kicked something off there. Yes, of course, please come to the stage and join us. Now, you've had a lot of thanks as the BMZ funder of a lot of this, so please can you share your question with us?
I just wanted to say thank you so much. Oh, yes, of course. So I'm Birgit Strube. I'm working for the German government. I'm working in the BMZ, and I must say I very much enjoy this discussion because we're working a lot and discussing a lot, about the value added of JETPs and platforms. And I must say I have, got a lot from this discussion. So thank you very much, panelists. I think I have 2 points I would like to make, and one is really something that is actually in the title of this discussion. It's about the role of the policy and investment plans. I mean, we've heard a lot now about the building blocks or the elements or the key issues that platform should contain, be it targets, ambitious targets, be it policies and reforms, private sector involvement, defining investment needs, project pipelines, and all that. In the JETPs, we have used the policy and investment plans to bring all this together. The NDC partnership uses partnership plans to bring parts of this together. So, I mean, my question is here, maybe for Brazil or ADB colleagues, do you think these kind of plans are a useful tool to keep everything together? Or is there other ways, how you can make sure that everyone has the same understanding of the platform and walks in the same direction? So really the question on the role of policy and investment plans. And my second point is, it also comes back to what Kate has said earlier, but it came up in the discussion also. We very much, as bilateral partners, we very much push for sectoral platforms. And we have a lot of discussion, about should it broad, should it be wide, should it be narrow? Should it be all NDC? Should it be sectoral, cross-sectoral? I understand, the issue that you say it should be an economy-wide platform. It should look at the transition of the economy, but then you really have a huge task ahead of you. And the beauty with the sectoral approach is that it's nice and tiny, but it leaves bits and pieces out. So I think that's something we need to discuss further, but I just like to hear views from the panel, or maybe from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Birgit. We'll stay here, and I have that second question as well, so thank you for asking it. Who would like to answer the first question about the role of policy and investment plans and whether that helps hold things together? Start with Kate and then hear from Brazil. Yeah, Kate, go ahead.
Okay, so I think they're good and bad. So yes, I think they serve a big purpose in terms of bringing together people quite quickly around a central aim and trying to do a plan. The one for Indonesia was prepared quickly for a plan. People still say, oh, it took 9 months, but if you're talking about a comprehensive plan, 9 months is not actually that long, and the ability to do really kind of deep analytical work that sits behind it is a bit limited. So I think what we need to caution is that we need to really remember that it's cascading plans, right? That you may have one high-level plan, but that you need other plans to influence other plans. And maybe to your second question, sectoral plans, and that need to cascade out of that. That one plan is never going to answer all of the problems. So if you have a broad structure in the plan, then you may need much more detailed planning underneath. But sometimes I think there's an expectation that that plan is then it. And further on that point, I think also it needs to be an evolving plan. You can't predict how things will go in implementation. And so I think it's actually really critical that as a central part of country platforms that we carve out resources and time to build the national planning capacity, right? And the national structure for planning, so that whatever initial plan is put together, that there's then capacity and planning ability to update that plan and really own it and then change it as things evolve.
Great. Yeah, Matias.
Yeah, well, actually I will follow Kate because we in the Ministry of Finance, we launched what we call the Ecological Transformation Plan, and at the beginning, it was to be a plan, and that was the idea. But during the government's first year, we started to develop the instruments that would build bottom up this plan. And in the end, we realized that there was no plan in the totality of it. Of course, I think John mentioned something very important. If you don't have a wider perspective, you cannot see, for instance, resources that should be reallocated, and you cannot see the places that you, or the sectors that you are not considering in its complexity or the challenges that you have to overcome. But I think that, well, we are quite well informed by, for instance, the national mitigation plans. Those, yeah, they are very science-based and using the integrated assessment models for all the technological possibilities. And those plans inform us of where we should look more carefully. But let me tell you guys this. In our assessment of this model, one solution that came up was to repair roads. And then when we presented this to, for instance, the foreigners advisors that we had, everybody came up and said, come on, you guys cannot be honest that you will set roads as something to mitigate emissions. And in the end, it was one of our best science-informed decisions. And this only could come up because we had instruments that were looking to sectoral necessities, but also instruments that were looking top-down to which should be the pathways that we should choose. But in this sense, to come to your second point, also bringing up what John mentioned about the bottom-up participation, not only from the society and the communities, but also from the government, from the market, sorry. So involving the sectors to choose which would be the technological routes that would be prioritized, and also setting the ambition for emissions in one side or the type of adaptation that should be chosen. It was crucial for us to understand that, of course, the government does not know everything, but the sectors do have a lot of information. So I think it is twofold. We must have a vision from top, but it comes from the bottom, all the solutions. And once again, everything must be politically viable, right? So a lot of recommendations that we had, they were not politically viable. And you have to find one way through it, using other instruments and other possibilities.
Super interesting. And actually, but again, if it's okay, I'm going to also ask this question of Crispian about whether you think it's whole of economy or sectoral and how you get that balance right, because I think you would have interesting perspectives, and I'm really curious about the answer too.
So there's certainly no one size fits all. I mean, South Africa picked a particular approach. We decided to go for a sector and then think through. I mean, the sector we chose obviously has broad economy-wide effects, and we had to think through all of the social and economic consequences around that sector. Adding other sectors, which other countries have done, I mean, I think we would have struggled if we had made it too complicated. I mean, the JETP was quite a challenge for us to get over the line, very transactionally intensive. So, yeah, I'm glad we picked a sector and focused on it. But equally, you know, I've seen the synergies that, you know, Egypt, Brazil, Colombia are getting by bringing climate, nature, energy, food into a conversation with each other. And I think that model's great. And I mean, the one thing I'm very keen to see is, you know, as we move into the G20 chair next year, is to see a new generation of country platforms coming forward that push the adaptation issue. I think that's vitally important, and we didn't factor it at all into our JETP thinking. So more adaptation and nature-focused plans, I think, are really exciting. It's the new frontier. They'll be harder to mobilize finance for in some instances, but not impossible. And I think we can put that stack together. So there's no one size fits all, is, you know, my short response. And each country should innovate to its own needs.
Super useful, and you heard it here first, maybe not first, but there's a real coalescence of the two presidencies of Brazil and South Africa around these country platforms and having more adaptation and nature in them. So Germany, well done for creating that. Thank you, Birgit. So, who else wants to ask a question? We've just got a bit more time, and we would love to, those were both excellent sets of questions. Or if you have a comment, because you may also have great wisdom in the audience of your experience with these issues, we would love to hear from you as well to add to the wisdom of the panel.
I actually have one comment while we're waiting.
Please, Kate, go ahead. Others, try not to be shy. Now, while Kate is speaking, build up your courage. Think of the question you really want to ask.
So just in terms of country platforms and adaptation, so ADB supported Bangladesh with the climate and development platform, and that's very adaptation focused. So have a look at that in terms of a platform that really came out with adaptation as the kind of core climate need.
Thank you. Very close to my heart. And yeah, thinking about how you put the finance behind, how you stack capital behind adaptation is something I think more work is needed on. Small advert, we're ready to do it for anyone who wants us to. Any more questions? I feel like you've got a question bubbling. No? Yeah. Well, lady with the mask, no. Yeah, okay. Yeah, please, why don't you come up? Tell us who you are.
Hello, I'm Hapsari from WRI Indonesia. So actually, I want to ask about a just transition framework, because Katie has mentioned before, and I know Crispian has worked a lot about it. I know that there's no one size fit all for the just transition framework, but could you please elaborate more, maybe what are the most or the key elements of this framework that you have probably in ADB or in the South Africa? And from what I know, it's more on the planning processes of, because you mentioned about impact assessment, it's usually before the project development. But yeah, other than planning processes, probably the framework, whether the framework is also covered like monitoring and evaluation of the just transition itself. So yeah, my question is whether we can really measure the transition is just or not. Thank you.
Was it Crispian, I think more for you, but also maybe Kate? Who wants to go first?
Sure. So on Indonesia, the Indonesian government has launched a white paper on just transition, which is a very initial step, but they have put something out there. So I think a few steps. First of all, and maybe that white paper starts to touch it for Indonesia, but it's not deep enough. I think having a clear understanding of what a just transition means for the country, right? And so what, if you are going to look to develop a framework or a policy or a commission or whatever the country wants to develop, that they have a clear vision on what they think a just transition means. And then I think governance and stakeholder mapping, right? So we hear a lot on this whole of economy, but particularly on just transition, it is an area where there is many parts of government involved and many stakeholders. And so what's the practical mechanism to bring together those parts of government to work on it? Because you need education, social, industrial, climate, energy, everyone. So what's the right structure for that country to have a just transition? And then you need the right analytics, right? So you need either sectoral analytics. So we're doing the Just Transition framework for the Philippines, and they've selected key sectors. So we'll start with the analytics in those sectors to really understand what the risks, opportunities, and that, and legal and regulatory analysis in those sectors as well to see what the barriers are, and then map out what a just transition pathway might be, either for that sector or for the country. And I mean, that's preliminary work, but it helps to then set a foundation to go forward. And I think the second aspect is on this issue of procedural justice. Crispian raised it, and it gets talked about so much in the just transition, and in Asia Pacific there's been a lot of discussion in Indonesia and Philippines about whether it really is dialogue or whether it's really the government makes one step and then presents it for comment. And so really thinking through what that participatory process looks like in the country and what you need to do to establish the right mechanisms for that. And I think that process needs funding as well, right? And a lot of the time the upfront planning and all that work isn't thought about in the bucket of funding that's going to come, but we need to think about that kind of bucket of funding that's needed for that preparation.
Okay, so just building on that, I mean, I would say the foundation for a just transition, well, let me start by saying just transition isn't the language everyone uses. So again, I don't think one size fits all. Some people talk about fair and equitable transitions. There are other ways of approaching it. Others just think about the social and economic consequences of transition. I mean, they're all pretty much in the same space, and I wouldn't get stuck on words. The important thing is to think through the foundational principles. So we adopted 3 principles, which is distributive justice, and that's really about making sure the risks and opportunities in the transition are fairly spread, and that you don't have workers and communities who basically carry all the risk and get none of the opportunity. And then Kate's already mentioned procedural justice and making sure that people are most affected are at the table. And we added restorative justice. So as we exit coal and fossil fuel areas, making sure that those degraded lands and watersheds and catchments are restored in some way or another. Like Kate said, I mean, we looked at the sectors that are most at risk. So, you know, coal is the one that's most frequently mentioned, but equally our auto workers who are going to be affected by the shift to renewables, a lot of our agricultural sector, because that's going to be dramatically affected by the changing climate and the shift to climate-smart agriculture. And then it's quite useful to think through the policy areas that you need for intervention. And I mentioned some of them earlier. So you've got to get the trade and industry people in the room talking about their master planning process and the incentives needed to drive new industry growth in key sectors. You've got to have the labor people with you, and higher education and basic education, so you can think about how you build your labor force for the future. And you've got to get all of the social policy and housing and other social development ministries in the room. And then also governance. I mean, we've got a very particular part of our one of our provinces in Mpumalanga is where most of the coal mining happens. So we've done a lot of work with the province and with the municipalities to get the right structures in place to manage the process. And then lastly, Treasury. You know, and I'm very glad Matias is here from the Brazilian Treasury. So, you know, we've put a lot of effort into getting Treasury to think through the funding mechanisms needed to drive this transition. So, you know, in addition to the carbon tax, which is creating a new revenue stream, they're thinking about how to recycle those revenues back into mitigating some of these areas that I've been talking about.
Brilliant. Wow. I hope that's helpful as you think about how you support Indonesia. That was excellent. Thanks, guys. I think we have time for one last question. Nate, are you? Yeah, Nate. There's a risk of WRI dominating in the questions, but we're curious people. Come up, Nate. Yeah, why not? Yeah. I hope you're going to ask how this relates to small island states or something very good. Good. Come and sit down.
Well, I also have to take notes. So, well, all right, I'll take notes seated here. Sorry, guys. So this has been awesome, and I've learned a lot in addition to just taking notes for WRI. But one of the things that I'm noticing is that we have two BRICS countries here. And so it's a very different conversation for countries that are either middle income or low income, especially SIDS and LDCs, that have very different financial systems and structures and capital markets. So I'm curious, putting you two on the spot might be a bit unfair because you're from South Africa and Brazil, but to the extent that any of the four of you have insights in terms of how do we take these same principles and try to apply them in very different circumstances to empower the same kind of just transition in places that operate very differently, but have the same right to those outcomes.
I should say Nate's also on the Tuvalu delegation. Sorry, Vanuatu. Oh, gosh, now I'm going to be in trouble. Vanuatu, thank you. So I think such a great question. Yeah. Yeah. I'd love to hear. And actually, why don't we start with John? Because I don't know if Standard Charter is working in Vanuatu. How do you do this in LDCs, SIDS, really different capital market environments?
So we're going to be trying to do it in Lesotho, which is significantly lower income than South Africa. And in a former life, I spent years living in the DRC, which is one of the poorest countries in the world. And I suppose it follows on from the previous point, is just transition means different things, but also let's not, the very notion of just transition, if we're not careful, can easily be distorted into a perception that everything that preceded the move to the low carbon economy was fine and just, and everything that follows could potentially be less just. And I think that's an important concept to challenge, because we know that the impact of hydrocarbon exploitation across Africa, for example, can be quite negative. You only have to ask the residents of the Niger Delta, or look at what's going on in Cap Delgado and in Mozambique and so on. So, the hydrocarbon economy has not been a intrinsically just economic system, and there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the move to a low carbon economy is inherently more distributed and inherently more just. So it's worth having that in mind, because of course there are plenty of people in the wider climate debate who are necessarily not keen that we progress very swiftly to a low-carbon economy, who are very happy to play on the issue of just transition as a reason to slow that transition down. And we know that kind of the most unjust transition of all is if climate change is allowed to sort of proceed in unmitigated fashion, because we know that it's going to hit the poorest hardest. So the transition to a low-carbon economy is inherently a just one. That's not to say, obviously, there are not winners and losers, and all the stuff that Crispian and others have been talking about is hugely important. But I think it's sometimes important to zoom the camera back, and particularly if you look like where I was previously in DRC, you know, the worst thing of all is to have no energy. The technology we have now with solar and battery and so on allows us to get distributed systems out to parts that the grid will never reach, and that's a hugely important and useful thing, and we're proud to work on mini grids in Standard Chartered.
I was worried you were going to avoid the question whether Standard Chartered works in these contexts, but since time is short, I'm not going to press you on this occasion, but we'll pin you down on that another time, because I'd like Kate to tell us a bit. You are working in Bangladesh, you are working with some of the Pacific Islands. Can you tell us, how do you have to adapt some of this for those contexts?
Sure. So we have a Just Transition support platform that started off with 6 countries, and we actually included Fiji, particularly because we really wanted to try to develop some thinking and support on what just transition means in an entirely different context. And it's another process of learning, but after 2 years, we still haven't agreed the scope of work with the government, because we're still trying to work out with them what just transition means in their context. And the conversation is going in many directions. I think one in Sid's context is, how does just transition relate to adaptation? And there are really polar views on that. There's people that think just transition fits squarely within decarbonisation. There's notions of just resilience coming out, and there's lots of different approaches. So I think trying to, so for example, one conversation was on relocation of communities in Fiji, right? So is that adaptation, or if you're looking at economic diversification in new locations, does that become just transition? Another one is, what's the driver for the potential change? So we were talking about the tuna canning industry, and whether that's affected by climate risk, but also maybe affected by changes in markets. So that type of issue. And then the last one, I think, particularly for the Pacific, is the link to fossil fuel subsidy reform. And so then that's when you get back to the issue of public budgets and fiscal space, and then how the kind of international transition risk and change around fossil fuels and fossil fuel subsidies, and how that kind of relates to a just transition context. So no clear answer. We're still trying to work through it, but certainly an area that we're really interested in kind of building dialogue and support. So come and talk to us if you want to talk about it further.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. And thank you, Nate. And this is the moment where there's not much time left, so I'm going to try and make Nate's job easier by summing up what I think we've heard from this really excellent panel. And what really strikes me is that what we've been talking about is all countries really getting onto a different economic pathway, one that's low carbon, climate resilient, even nature positive, and inclusive. And I think I got 4 messages from this panel. The first is the importance of political leadership and country ownership. And that includes having cross-government coordination, including private sector and citizens right from the beginning, really having a whole of government, whole of economy, whole of society approach to make sure that this is a just transition. Secondly, I heard about, with the whole economy approach, that this is about economic reconfiguration and sectoral transformation. And we have to realize how systematic the change is and how important upstream reform is. Everything from the financial system reform to policies across trade and industrial, social policies, labor policies, through to the policy environment and regulation for particular sectors. And I think this panel really brought that forward. Thirdly, I really heard about the whole of the financial system approach, that this means putting the capital stack behind the NDC implementation in a really strategic way, with domestic finance as the backbone, as Crispian spoke of, but the MDBs and the national development banks playing a really important role for blending and de-risking and working with the private sector to design instruments that can really crowd in private finance in a repeatable way. And finally, I had messages that I think are about what the international system needs to do, and thank you, Kate, particularly for pointing these out to us. I think you talked about long-term capacity building that's needed for government and the analysis and governance reforms that are required, and the need for us to be more strategic, perhaps, and more coordinated in the way we offer that support. I heard about the importance of coordination within MDBs. Extraordinary to even hear that that's a challenge across MDBs with national development banks and working with the private sector, and the idea of finding repeatable structures that I think came from John. So these were the 4 things that I really was left with from this panel. I want to ask you all to join me with a huge round of applause to thank our panel. And I do want to finish then with a round of applause just in a moment for thanking BMZ and the German government. Thank you for hosting us here. It's been a really fantastic format, actually, and venue for us. I want to thank you personally from WRI. You've enabled us to do some work on what it takes to have a just transition and have multi-stakeholder dialogues on that. But above all, I think we've heard from each of the panelists, and I think it's not just because they're polite. I think it's because Germany genuinely has been a trailblazer in this space, leading the work on the just transition, supporting countries as they come forward with their JETPs and their country platforms. So thank you for everything you're doing in this space, the thought leadership, and the way you're taking us forward. Thank you, everybody. Have a good evening.
Welcome to the German Climate Pavilion at COP29 in Baku. Germany. Climate solutions, fast and fair.